The envelope was ordinary in every way. White, slightly creased at one corner, stamped with the logo of a charitable foundation that Marcellus Viramont Hale had quietly funded for over a decade. His assistant had placed it on his desk alongside 12 others that Thursday morning, and for almost 4 hours it sat there, unopened, while he moved through conference calls and contract reviews without once glancing at it. It was not until late afternoon, when the last meeting had ended and the office had gone still, that Marcellus finally reached across the desk, picked up the envelope, and slid his letter opener beneath the flap. He expected nothing out of the ordinary. He found something that would change the rest of his life. Inside was a routine philanthropic audit report, the kind of document that crossed his desk regularly, full of clinical language and formatted tables. He began to read with the practiced disinterest of a man who had trained himself over many years to process information without letting it disturb him. But then, on the third page, a single paragraph stopped him completely. It described a young man, 20 years of age, admitted to a county hospital, with advanced respiratory complications. The patient had been identified as Kylam Voss. No verifiable birth certificate, no consistent medical history. A background described as fragmented and undocumented. And then, the detail that made Marcellus set the report down on the desk and press both hands flat against the surface. A note about a partial DNA compatibility flag. A routine cross-reference against a private genetic database used by missing child organizations. The database that Marcellus himself had been funding since the year his 3-year-old son disappeared. The compatibility indicator did not confirm identity. It only suggested proximity. But for a man who had spent 17 years telling himself there was nothing left to find, proximity was more than enough to shake the ground beneath him. Marcellus did not move from his chair for a long time. Outside his office window, the city continued its indifferent rhythm. Traffic, voices, the distant sound of a siren fading into the late afternoon. None of it reached him. He was somewhere else entirely, somewhere that existed before the glass and steel of his current life, in a much smaller world that had once meant everything to him. To understand what that paragraph meant to Marcellus Hale, it is necessary to understand the man he had been before, and the events that transformed him into someone almost unrecognizable. 17 years earlier, Marcellus was a different person. He was 35 years old, recently widowed, and still navigating the complicated grief of losing his wife, Ilara, to a sudden illness less than a year after their son Arendor was born. He had not handled that loss gracefully. No one does. But Marcellus had thrown himself into work and into fatherhood with an intensity that bordered on desperation, as though keeping busy could somehow fill the space that Ilara had left behind. Arendor, small and curious and entirely unaware of all the grief swirling around him, had become the single uncomplicated joy in his father's life. People who knew Marcellus from that period would later say that the version of him they remembered, laughing in the backyard on summer evenings, building elaborate block towers that Arendor would immediately knock down, reading the same picture book 4 times in a row without complaint, was someone they had difficulty reconciling with the man he eventually became. The transformation, they said, happened all at once, but that was not entirely accurate. Transformations that appear sudden always have a precise beginning point. His began on a Tuesday morning in early October, when Arendor was 3 years old. Marcellus had left for an early meeting. A household employee, who had worked for the family for 2 years and had given no cause for concern, was responsible for the boy that morning. When Marcellus returned home at noon, the house was quiet in a way that immediately felt wrong. The employee was gone. Arendor's shoes were still by the front door, the small blue ones with the Velcro straps that he could not yet fasten himself. The back door was unlocked. A cup of apple juice sat on the kitchen table, half finished, as though the child had simply stepped away for a moment and would return. He never did. Police were called within the hour. The investigation that followed lasted months, generated hundreds of leads, and ultimately resolved nothing. The case was eventually classified as an abduction and filed among the thousands of unresolved missing children cases that accumulate in law enforcement records every year, each one representing a family still waiting for an answer. Marcellus waited. And when waiting produced nothing, he did what he knew how to do. He organized, he funded, he directed. He hired private investigators. He contacted advocacy organizations. He donated to DNA databases and missing child registries, not out of obvious generosity, but because he needed somewhere to direct the energy that had no other outlet. He was not by nature a man who spoke openly about pain. He was a man who built structures around it. Over the years, those structures became his entire life. The real estate investments that expanded his wealth were not a passion. They were scaffolding. The professional reputation for coldness and precision was not arrogance. It was armor. The deliberate absence of close relationships was not preference. It was the only way he had found to keep functioning without resolving the thing that could not be resolved. And so the years passed. Arendor would have been 4, then 7, then 12. Marcellus tracked it privately, the way you track the progress of something you cannot see but cannot stop thinking about. He kept a photograph, just one, inside the top drawer of his desk. It showed a dark-haired boy in a blue jacket, laughing at something just outside the frame. Marcellus never displayed it. He rarely looked at it. But he never moved it either. Now, sitting in the quiet of his office with the audit report on the desk in front of him, he opened that drawer without thinking. He looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called the foundation's director. "The report you sent me," he said when the call connected. "Page 3, the patient identified as Calum Voss." He kept his voice level. He was very practiced at that. "I need everything you have. The hospital name, the attending physicians, the full documentation of the DNA flag." A pause. "And I need it tonight." The director began to explain the privacy protocols involved in sharing patient information. Marcellus listened politely until the explanation was finished. Then he said simply, "I understand the protocols. Please send the documentation tonight." He ended the call and sat back. Around him, the office was as familiar and controlled as it had always been. The clean lines of the furniture, the ordered stacks of files, the city visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows like a painting that never changed. He had built this environment deliberately, over many years, as a counterweight to everything he could not control. It had served its purpose. It had kept him functional and productive and, in the particular way that isolation can be comfortable, reasonably undisturbed. But a single paragraph on a philanthropic audit report had done something that 17 years of careful construction had been designed to prevent. It had made him feel the thing he had been building around. Somewhere in a county hospital, in a bed connected to machines that were doing part of the work his lungs apparently could no longer do on their own, there was a young man named Calum Voss. He was 20 years old. He had no verifiable history. He had come from nowhere that anyone could clearly document. And his DNA, partial, flagged, unconfirmed, had somehow found its way back to a database that a grieving father had funded from a distance for over a decade, hoping that something, someday, might eventually find its way home. Marcellus looked at the photograph one more time. He looked for a long time at the dark-haired boy in the blue jacket, laughing at something just outside the frame. Then he closed the drawer. Whatever was coming next, he would face it the way he had faced everything else since the morning those small blue shoes were left by the front door, methodically, carefully, and with the particular kind of hope that a person carries when they have learned, through long experience, that hope must be handled very gently, because it is both the most necessary thing in the world and the most fragile. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a house after loss. It is not the silence of emptiness, exactly. It is something more specific than that. It is the silence of a space that was built around the presence of someone who is no longer there. Every room carries the memory of sound. The hallway where small feet used to run. The kitchen where a high chair once sat. Beside the table. The corner of the living room where toys were left, scattered at the end of each day, waiting to be played with again the following morning. Marcellus Viramont Hale had lived inside that silence for 17 years. He had learned to move through it without flinching. He had learned to answer questions about his personal life with the kind of brief, professionally courteous responses that discouraged further inquiry. He had learned, most importantly, to fill the silence with enough activity and structure that most days it was barely noticeable. A low hum beneath everything, present but ignorable, the way certain sounds become invisible to a person who has grown accustomed to them. But silence, no matter how well managed, does not disappear. It waits. And on the evening that Marcellus sat in his office with a philanthropic audit report open on his desk, the silence that had waited for 17 years suddenly had a name attached to it again. Not the name he had given his son. A different name. Calum Voss, belonging to a young man he had never met, in a hospital bed he had never visited, with a partial DNA flag that had not yet been confirmed as anything more than coincidence. It was enough. It was more than enough. He stayed in the office until nearly midnight, waiting for the documentation the Foundation's director had promised. When it arrived, a scanned file attached to a brief, cautious email, he read it 3 times. Then he opened a blank document, began to take notes, and did not stop until the city outside his window had gone quiet, and the cleaning crew had come and gone without him acknowledging them once. By the time he finally left the building, he had the beginning of a plan, and Marcellus Viramont Hale, whatever else might be said about him, had always been very good at plans. To understand why the events that followed unfolded the way they did, it is worth returning to the beginning, not to the morning of the disappearance, but further back than that, to the years before grief became the organizing principle of a man's entire existence. To the time when Marcellus was still, in the most ordinary and valuable sense of the word, simply a father. He had grown up in a mid-sized city in the Midwest, the son of a civil engineer and a school teacher, who had raised him with an emphasis on discipline, self-reliance, and the kind of quiet pride that expresses itself through work rather than words. He was not an unhappy child. He was a focused one. He did well in school not because learning came easily to him, but because he approached every subject with the same methodical patience he would later apply to business, breaking problems into components, addressing each component in sequence, and refusing to move forward until he understood what he was working with. He studied economics at a state university, graduated without distinction, but without difficulty, and entered the workforce at 23 with a modest amount of ambition and a very clear sense of how he intended to direct it. Real estate, he had decided, operated on principles he found genuinely comprehensible. Land had value. Location determined that value, and the careful assessment of both could generate returns that rewarded patience over impulse. He was patient. He was not impulsive. The fit was almost exact. By 30, he had built a small but solid portfolio of commercial properties. By 33, that portfolio had grown considerably, and he had acquired the kind of professional reputation, reliable, precise, not particularly warm, that attracts serious investors and deters casual ones. He was not wealthy by the standards of the industry's upper tier, but he was secure and still climbing, and he knew it. Alara came into his life at 32, introduced by a mutual acquaintance at a dinner party that Marcellus had attended reluctantly and nearly left early. She was a landscape architect, thoughtful and quietly funny, with a habit of noticing small things, the particular quality of light in a room, the way a conversation shifted when someone felt uncomfortable, the kind of detail that most people move through without registering. She noticed Marcellus at that dinner. She noticed that he was paying very close attention to everything around him while giving every outward appearance of detachment. She found this interesting rather than off-putting, which was either wisdom or a very specific kind of patience, and possibly both. They were married 2 years later, in a small ceremony that both of them preferred to a large one. Their life together was not dramatic. It was steady and attentive and full of the small pleasures that steady, attentive people build for themselves. Sunday mornings with coffee and the paper, long walks in the evening, the gradual accumulation of inside references and shared opinions, and the particular comfort of being known by someone who has chosen to know you. Arendor was born when Marcellus was 34. He arrived, as most children do, with no understanding whatsoever of the magnitude of what he had just done to 2 people's lives. He was small and loud and required an enormous amount of attention, and produced in return a quality of joy that Marcellus had not previously encountered and could not have anticipated. He had expected to love his child. He had not expected that love to feel like a restructuring of everything he understood about what mattered. Ilara died 11 months after Arendor was born. The illness came quickly, as the most devastating ones sometimes do. A diagnosis that arrived already advanced. A treatment window that proved narrower than the doctors had initially indicated, and then an outcome that no amount of careful planning or professional competence could alter. She was 34 years old. She had planted a garden in their backyard the previous spring that was still, that autumn, producing the last of its season's flowers. Marcellus did not speak publicly about that period of his life. Not then, and not in any of the years that followed. Those who knew him during those months described someone who continued to function, who attended meetings, reviewed contracts, made decisions, but who did so with a quality of absence, as though the person performing these actions was operating from somewhere slightly removed from the immediate present. What kept him present, in the most literal sense, was Arendor. A child of 1, then nearly 2, then approaching 3, has no capacity to soften his demands for the convenience of adult grief. He needed feeding and bathing and playing and comforting, and the steady repetition of routines that gave his small world its shape. Marcellus provided all of it, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary, and because necessity had always been for him a more reliable motivator than emotion alone. He hired help when the workload required it. He adjusted his professional schedule to accommodate school drop-offs and pediatric appointments. He read the same picture books until he had them memorized, built the block towers, pushed the swing, learned the names of all the cartoon characters that Arendor found important. And somewhere in the middle of all that necessity, something shifted. The routines that had begun as obligation became, gradually and without announcement, the part of his day he valued most. The half-hour before Arendor's bedtime, when the boy was tired enough to be still and would lean against his father's arm while a story was being read. The Saturday mornings when they walked to the park together, and Arendor stopped every 30 feet to investigate something on the ground. A beetle, a bottle. Cap, a particularly interesting stick, with the focused curiosity of someone for whom the world was still entirely new and endlessly worth examining. He was not a perfect father. He knew that. He was sometimes distracted, sometimes impatient, sometimes too quick to default to structure when what was needed was flexibility. But he was present. He was trying. And the boy, in the uncomplicated way of very young children, seemed to find this sufficient. October arrived that year the way it always does in the Midwest, with a sharpness in the air and a change in the quality of light that is difficult to describe precisely but immediately recognizable, as though the world has adjusted its contrast settings overnight. Marcellus had a morning meeting that he could not reschedule, an important one involving a commercial property acquisition that had been in negotiation for several months. He had arranged for the household employee, a woman named Mrs. Farron who had worked for the family for 2 years, and whom he had no reason to distrust, to stay with Arendor until he returned. He remembered saying goodbye to his son that morning. He remembered Arendor in his pajamas at the top of the stairs holding a stuffed rabbit that had been a gift from Ilara's mother and that he carried everywhere. He remembered the boy's expression, not sad, not anxious, simply present in the way that very young children are present, inhabiting each moment completely without awareness of the next. 1. He did not know, as he pulled out of the driveway, that he was looking at that expression for the last time. When he came home at noon, the house had the wrong kind of silence. He knew it before he had fully processed what he was seeing. The unlocked back door, the half-finished juice on the kitchen table, the small blue shoes beside the front door with the Velcro straps that Arendor could not yet fasten on his own. Mrs. Farron's coat was gone from the hook in the entryway. Her phone, when he called it immediately, rang without answer. He searched the house in under 3 minutes. Then, he called the police. The investigation that followed was, by every account that Marcellus later reviewed in exhaustive detail, deeply inadequate. Not maliciously so, perhaps, but inadequate in the way that investigations sometimes are when resources are limited and early leads dry up quickly, and the pressure to formally resolve a case increases as weeks become months. The lead detective was later reassigned. Key evidence was cataloged incorrectly. Witnesses who might have been interviewed more thoroughly were not. And Mrs. Farron, whose real name turned out not to be Mrs. Farron at all, was never found. The case was closed. Not solved. Closed. Marcellus appealed the closure. He hired attorneys. He commissioned independent reviews. He did everything that a man with resources and determination could do, and none of it produced Arendor. Eventually, the attorneys advised him that continuing to pursue active investigation through legal channels was unlikely to yield different results. He thanked them for their time. He paid their invoices. He did not stop looking. He simply stopped looking loudly. That was the man who sat in the office that Thursday evening, reading AES philanthropic audit report for the third time. Not a cold man exactly. A man who had constructed coldness as a working environment because it was the only temperature at which he had found he could continue to operate. Not an unfeeling man. Quite the opposite. A man who had learned, through the specific education that only devastating loss can provide, that feeling everything at full volume was not sustainable, and that the only alternative was to build very careful walls and live very carefully inside them. The DNA flag in the report had not, by itself, confirmed anything. He knew that. He was not a man given to wishful thinking, or rather, he had trained himself out of it, because he had learned firsthand how costly wishful thinking could be when it collapsed. But the flag existed. Calum Voss existed. The partial compatibility existed. And Marcellus Virmont Hale, who had spent 17 years learning how to live without hope, found that he was not, after all, entirely finished with it. He closed the document on his screen, gathered his notes, and put on his coat. Tomorrow, he would begin. Marcellus began the way he always began anything that mattered, with a list. It was a habit he had developed early in his professional life and refined over decades of practice. Before any significant decision, before any complex negotiation, before any situation that required him to move carefully through uncertain terrain, he sat down and wrote out everything he knew. Everything he did not know, and everything he needed to find out. The act of writing it down was not about memory. His memory was excellent. It was about clarity. It was about forcing the shapeless anxiety of an unresolved situation into a structure that could be examined, addressed, and systematically reduced. He did this on the Friday morning after receiving the audit report at 5:45 in the morning at the kitchen table of his apartment with a cup of coffee that went cold beside him while he worked. By 7 o'clock, he had 3 pages of notes divided into categories: confirmed, facts, unconfirmed indicators, required documentation, and open questions. The list of open questions was the longest section by a considerable margin. Who was Calum Voss precisely, and where had he lived before his hospitalization? Who was Lyrise Covan, the woman registered as his responsible guardian in the hospital's intake documents? How had a partial DNA compatibility flag been generated, and how reliable was that flag given the database's matching protocols? What were the specific medical circumstances that had led to Calum's current hospitalization, and how long had his condition been developing? And underneath all of those questions, the one he had not written down, but that was present in every line he had written. Was this Arendor? He did not allow himself to dwell on that question directly. Not yet. Dwelling on it before he had sufficient evidence would accomplish nothing, except to compromise his judgment, and compromised judgment at this stage could cause him to move too quickly, alert the wrong people, or damage whatever legal options might eventually become available to him. He had learned that lesson once, 17 years ago, when he had pushed too hard too fast. In the early weeks of the investigation, and inadvertently caused 2 witnesses to become uncooperative. He would not make that mistake again. So he folded the question carefully and set it aside, the way you set aside something valuable and breakable when you need both hands free to work. Then he picked up the phone and called the only private investigator he still trusted. Daniel Forsyth had worked for Marcellus on 3 separate occasions over the years, all of them connected, in one way or another, to the ongoing search for Arendor. He was a former law enforcement officer in his early 60s, methodical and unhurried, with a professional manner that inspired confidence without demanding it. He was not the most aggressive investigator Marcellus had ever hired, and there had been moments, early in their working relationship, when Marcellus had considered replacing him with someone who moved faster. He was glad, in retrospect, that he had not. Forsyth's value was not speed. It was precision. He did not move quickly, but he did not miss things either. And in an investigation where missing things had already cost 17 years, precision was worth considerably more than speed. Forsyth answered on the second ring, which meant he was already awake. Marcellus outlined the situation in 4 minutes, giving him the relevant facts without editorializing. There was a pause when he finished. "How solid is the DNA flag?" Forsyth asked. "Partial match. The database uses a tiered compatibility system. This registered at the second tier, which means meaningful biological proximity, but not conclusive identity confirmation. So it could be a relative, a cousin, someone on the maternal line." "It could be," Marcellus said, "which is why I need the full picture before I draw any conclusions." Another pause. "What do you need from me first?" "Background on Calum Voss. Everything available. Residential history, school records, any public documentation of his existence going back as far as it goes. And the same for Larissa Coven. I want to know who she is, where she came from, and how she came to be listed as this young man's guardian. Timeline? As fast as thorough allows." Forsyth said he would be in touch. Marcellus trusted that he would be. While Forsyth began his preliminary research, Marcellus turned his attention to the medical documentation. This required a different approach. Patient records were protected by privacy laws that could not simply be bypassed, and Marcellus was not interested in bypassing them, not because he was indifferent to legal boundaries, but because any information obtained improperly would be worthless in a court proceeding, and he was already thinking, with the forward-focused discipline that defined him, about what might eventually be needed in court. Instead, he contacted his attorney, a sharp and experienced woman named Patricia Hensley, who had handled his legal affairs for 12 years and who was, by this point, entirely accustomed to receiving calls from him that were more complicated than they initially appeared. He explained the situation. He explained what he needed. He explained his reasoning for pursuing it carefully rather than aggressively. Patricia listened without interrupting, which was one of the things he valued most about her. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "If the DNA flag registers at the level you're describing, we may have grounds to petition for a court-ordered full genetic analysis. That would require filing in the jurisdiction where the hospital is located and demonstrating a credible biological connection claim. It's not a fast process." "I'm not interested in fast," Marcellus said. "I'm interested in airtight." "Then give me 48 hours to review the documentation and identify the correct filing jurisdiction. Meantime, do not contact the hospital directly. Do not attempt to access any patient information through informal channels, and do not make contact with anyone listed in those records." He agreed to all 3 conditions. He was very good at restraint when restraint was the correct strategy. The 48 hours that followed were among the more difficult of his recent memory, which was saying something, given the general character of his recent memory. He went to work. He attended his scheduled meetings. He reviewed contracts and approved budgets and responded to correspondence with the Gaibor, same level of competence that his staff had come to expect from him. None of them noticed anything different. He had been performing normalcy for so long that by this point it required almost no effort. But underneath the performance, something was running continuously, a kind of low, persistent awareness that he could not switch off, a background process that was always, on some level, cycling through the same sequence of facts and questions regardless of what he was doing in the foreground. On the evening of the second day, Forsyth called. "Calum Voss," he said without preamble, "is a ghost." Marcellus waited. "There is almost nothing on him before the age of 8. No birth certificate filed under that name in any state registry I can access. No school enrollment records before 3rd grade, and the school that enrolled him at that point accepted documentation that, based on what I'm seeing, was almost certainly falsified. He has a social security number. It was assigned when he was approximately 9 years old, which is unusual, but not impossible if someone was processing a delayed registration. The address history associated with that number shows 9 different residences across 4 states over 11 years. None of those residences are in particularly stable or well-documented neighborhoods. And Larissa Coven? She's real. which is more than can be said for some of the documentation around her. 47 years old, originally from out of state. A history of low-income residential movement. She's lived in 11 different addresses over roughly the same period. She has a minor record. 2 citations for inadequate living conditions following welfare check visits, one of which explicitly mentioned a minor child in the home. Both citations resulted in fines that were partially paid and eventually discharged. No criminal charges. Marcellus absorbed this. The welfare check visits. Did either of them result in removal of the child? No. The documentation from both visits notes that conditions, while below standard, did not meet the threshold for immediate removal. The child was present, appeared physically present and responsive, and there were no indicators of— Forsyth paused, and Marcellus could hear him consulting his notes— of acute harm sufficient to justify intervention. The phrase sat in the room like something with weight, appeared physically present and responsive. What about financial records? Marcellus asked. That's where it gets more interesting. Forsyth's tone shifted slightly. The particular shift that meant he was moving from background information into something he considered significant. Larice Covan has an inconsistent income history. Legitimate employment for short periods, then gaps, then employment again. But there are deposits in her banking history, not large, but regular, that don't correspond to any employment source I can identify. They began roughly 12 years ago, and continued, with some interruptions, until about 3 years back. How regular? Every 3 to 4 months, varying amounts, but within a consistent range. Small enough not to trigger automatic reporting requirements, large enough to be meaningful to someone at her income level. Where did the money come from? I don't have that yet. The source accounts are registered to LLCs that will require deeper tracing, but the pattern is consistent with payments designed to maintain silence about something without attracting the attention that a regular monthly payment might. Marcellus was quiet for a moment. Outside his window, the city moved through its evening without any awareness of this conversation. Keep tracing, he said. Everything you can access through legal channels. I want the full financial picture. Understood. There's one more thing. Go ahead. The hospital where Calum Voss is currently admitted. I pulled what public records exist on his admission history there. He has been a patient at that facility or at clinics affiliated with it multiple times over the past 6 years. The presenting condition, respiratory, appears in his records as far back as 6 years ago, when it was documented as mild but notable. The progression to his current state suggests that either the condition was not adequately treated at earlier stages, or that adequate treatment was not consistently accessible to him. Marcellus was quiet for longer this time. Are you saying the condition was treatable earlier? I'm saying the records suggest it was identified earlier. Whether it was treatable at that stage is a medical question I'm not qualified to answer. But the gap between first documentation and current severity is something a medical expert would likely find significant. After the call ended, Marcellus sat in the quiet for a few minutes. He was thinking about a 3-year-old boy in blue pajamas at the top of a staircase, holding a stuffed rabbit. He was thinking about all the mornings that had followed that morning and all the decisions, small ones, quiet ones, decisions made by people he had never met in circumstances he had never been allowed to examine, that had accumulated, one on top of another, into the situation now unfolding in a hospital room somewhere across the city. He was not a man given to anger. He had processed anger over the years into something quieter and more controlled, a kind of steady, directed pressure that he applied to problems until they yielded. It was more useful than anger. It lasted longer. It did not compromise judgment the way anger did. But sitting in that quiet, going over Forsyth's report in his mind, he felt something moving beneath the controlled surface that was older and less manageable than the version of himself he had spent 17 years constructing. He let it move. He noted its presence. Then he set it aside and returned to the list. On the morning of the 3rd day, Patricia. Hensley called with the filing strategy. The legal framework for petitioning a court-ordered genetic analysis was navigable, she explained, but would require a carefully constructed affidavit establishing the credible basis for the biological connection claim. She had drafted a preliminary version and wanted to walk him through it. They spent 2 hours on the phone. He approved the approach with 3 modifications. She said she would have the petition ready to file by the end of the week. That same afternoon, Forsyth called again with an early finding on the financial trail. One of the LLC source accounts, he said, had been registered to a business address that appeared in public property records. The registered agent for that business had a name. That name, when cross-referenced against records from 17 years ago, appeared on a single document, a background check that had been run as part of the original police investigation into Arendor's disappearance. The investigation that had been closed without resolution. The investigation that, according to all official records, had followed every available lead. Marcellus asked Forsyth to read the name again. He listened, carefully. Then he wrote it down, placed the pen on the table with great deliberateness, and looked at what he had written. He had spent 17 years assuming that the failure of the original investigation was a failure of resources and circumstances. Inadequate funding, limited leads, the ordinary tragedy of an imperfect system doing imperfect work on an impossible problem. What he was now looking at suggested something different. "Keep going," he said. "I want everything." By the end of that week, the petition was filed. The court acknowledged receipt. The process, as Patricia had warned, would not be fast, but it was moving. For the first time in 17 years, something connected to that October morning was actually moving, not spinning in place, not closing without resolution, but moving forward, one methodical step at a time, toward something that might finally be an answer. Marcellus did not allow himself to feel relieved. Relief was premature. There were many steps between a filed petition and a confirmed answer, and any of them could produce a result he was not prepared for, including the result in which Calum Voss was not Arendor at all, in which the DNA flag was coincidence, in which he had spent another week of his life chasing the most persistent hope he had ever carried and found, again, that it led nowhere. He acknowledged that possibility. He held it alongside the other possibility. He continued working. That was what you did, he had learned. He had. When the thing you were waiting for was something you could not afford to need too much and could not manage to need any less. You kept working. You kept the list. You moved forward, one careful step at a time. And you waited to see what the evidence, when it finally arrived, would say. The hospital was a mid-sized county facility on the eastern edge of the city, the kind of building that had been constructed in the 1970s, with the practical ambitions of its era, and had been expanded and renovated in irregular intervals ever since, producing an architecture that was neither coherent nor entirely without character. A main building in pale brick, connected by enclosed walkways to newer wings, whose glass and steel announced their more recent origins, without quite harmonizing with what came before. The parking lot was large and mostly full. The lobby had the particular quality of light that hospital lobbies always seem to have, slightly too bright and slightly too still, as though the building itself was holding its breath. Marcellus arrived on a Tuesday morning, 8 days after receiving the audit report. He had not come to see Calum Voss, not yet. Patricia had been explicit on that point. Until the court petition had been formally acknowledged and a legal framework established for contact, any direct approach to the patient or his listed guardian could jeopardize the proceedings. What Marcellus had come for was more preliminary than that. He had a meeting with the hospital's patient advocacy coordinator, a woman named Sandra Ola, who had agreed to speak with him in her official capacity about the general procedures surrounding unaccompanied or inadequately documented patients. It was, on its surface, a routine inquiry. He had framed it that way, deliberately. He was shown to a small office on the second floor. Sandra Ola was a woman in her mid-50s, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the unhurried manner of someone who had worked in institutional settings long enough to have developed a genuine, rather than performed, patience. She offered him coffee. He accepted it. They sat. He asked his questions carefully. General questions, administrative questions, the kind that established context without revealing specific interest. She answered them with the candor of a professional who had nothing to hide and no reason to be guarded. And in the course of that conversation, conducted entirely at the level of procedure and policy, he learned 3 things that Forsyth's external research had not been able to tell him. The first was that Calum Voss had been admitted to this specific hospital 4 times in the preceding 6 years, always presenting with respiratory symptoms of increasing severity, and that on at least 2 of those occasions, the attending medical staff had flagged the case for social services review due to concerns about the patient's living conditions and the consistency of his ongoing care. The second was that both of those social services referrals had been formally logged but had not, according to the records Sandra could reference, resulted in any documented follow-up visit or intervention. The third was that Calum Voss, on each of his admissions, had arrived alone. Not accompanied by his listed guardian. Not brought in by a family member or friend. Alone, either having made his own way to the emergency department or having been brought in by a neighbor or bystander who had observed him in distress and had not remained long enough to be documented. Marcellus thanked Sandra Ola for her time. He finished his coffee. He rode the elevator back to the lobby and walked through the glass doors into the pale morning light of the parking lot. He sat in his car for a few minutes before starting the engine. Arrived alone. 4 times, over 6 years. He started the car. He drove back to his office. He added 3 items to the list. The court's formal acknowledgement of the petition arrived 11 days later. Patricia called him within the hour. The acknowledgement did not grant the petition. It simply confirmed that the petition had been received, assigned to a judge, and placed on the docket for preliminary review. The process, she reminded him, could still take weeks. The opposing party, which in this context meant Lyrese Covan, as Calum's listed guardian, would be notified and given the opportunity to respond. If she chose to contest the petition, the timeline would extend further. What are the grounds on which she could contest it? Marcellus asked. Several. She could argue that the DNA compatibility flag does not constitute sufficient grounds for the petition. She could challenge the validity of the database used for the cross-reference. She could argue that even if a biological connection exists, that connection does not automatically confer the rights you're asserting. And she could challenge your standing to bring the petition at all, on the basis that you have no confirmed relationship to the patient. And how strong are those challenges? Patricia was quiet for a moment in the way that good attorneys are quiet when they are choosing their words with precision. They are not without merit, she said finally. Which is why the affidavit I filed was as detailed as it was. We anticipated the likely points of challenge and addressed them preemptively. I believe our position is solid, but I want you to understand that solid does not mean guaranteed. He understood. He had never expected guaranteed. Guaranteed was not a category that life had taught him to rely upon. Keep me informed of any response from Covan, he said, and let me know the moment we have a hearing date. Lyrese Covan did not contest the petition. This surprised Patricia somewhat. It did not entirely surprise Marcellus, though he would not have predicted it with certainty. He had thought about Lyrese Covan a great deal over the preceding weeks, had tried, with the deliberate effort he brought to understanding any situation he was navigating, to construct a picture of who she was and what her position actually was in this series of events. The picture that emerged from Forsyth's research and from his own analysis was not a simple one. She was not, as far as any evidence indicated, a person of significant resources or influence. She was a woman who had moved frequently, worked inconsistently, lived in conditions that multiple official visits had characterized as substandard, and had received irregular payments from a source that was still being traced, but that appeared connected, however distantly, to the original disappearance of Arundel Hale. What that connection meant, whether she had been an active participant in whatever had happened 17 years ago, or a later recipient of a situation she had inherited without fully understanding or something more complicated than either, was not yet clear. Forsyth was still working. The financial trail was still being followed, but her decision not to contest the petition suggested, to Marcellus's reading, one of 2 things. Either she had been advised by whatever counsel she had access to that contesting would be futile and potentially damaging, or she had reasons of her own for not wanting to draw judicial attention to the details of Calum Voss's history. Possibly both. The court-ordered genetic analysis was scheduled for a Friday morning, 3 weeks after the petition had been filed. Calum Voss was still in the hospital. His condition had stabilized, according to the limited information Patricia had been able to obtain through official channels, but he had not been discharged. A hospital social worker would be present during the process. The analysis itself, conducted by an independent laboratory appointed by the court, would require a simple cheek swab from both Marcellus and the patient. Marcellus arrived at the hospital that Friday with Patricia and said almost nothing during the administrative process that preceded the sample collection. He was brought to a consultation room. A technician explained the procedure in clear, brief language. He provided his sample. And then, for the first time, he was in the same building as the young man who might be his son. He did not see Calum that day. The patient's sample was collected separately in his room by the same technician. The protocol did not include a meeting between the parties. Marcellus had not asked for one. He was not ready for one, and more practically, neither the legal framework nor the emotional logic of the situation permitted it yet. But he was aware, sitting in that consultation room in a chair that faced a window overlooking the parking lot, that somewhere in this building, 2 floors up, according to the floor plan he had studied, in a room whose number he had not permitted himself to memorize, there was a young man who did not know he was here. He looked at the parking lot for a while. Then he thanked the technician, collected Patricia, and left. The results would take 10 business days. He had known this going in. He had told himself multiple times and with varying degrees of conviction that 10 business days was not a long time relative to 17 years, and that the equanimity he had developed over those 17 years was more than sufficient to carry him through 10 additional days of waiting. He was, after all, practiced at waiting. He had made a discipline of it. What he had not fully accounted for was the difference between waiting for something that remained entirely abstract and waiting for something that had, in the preceding weeks, acquired a face. He had not seen Calum's face, technically, but he had seen his name on documents. He had heard details of his life, the 9 residences, the falsified enrollment records, the 4 hospital admissions, the fact that he had arrived each time alone. He had heard Forsyth describe the progression of a respiratory condition that had been documented years before it became critical. He had sat in the same building and known, with a specificity, that earlier weeks had not provided, that the young man whose DNA was now being compared to his own was a real person with a real history, and that history was not one that anyone responsible for his welfare should be comfortable examining closely. The 10 days were not easy. He worked through them. He kept his schedule. He continued the investigation through Forsyth's ongoing research, adding pieces to the picture without yet having the central piece that would determine what everything else meant. On the 8th day, Forsyth traced the LLC's source account to its origin. The registered agent, whose name Marcellus had written down 3 weeks earlier, was a man who had worked 17 years ago as a part-time consultant to the investigative firm that had been contracted to assist the police in their search for Arundel Hale. He had not been a primary investigator. He had been a peripheral figure, someone who had handled document processing and database searches, whose name had appeared on 2 filings and then disappeared from the record entirely when the investigation wound down. The payments to Lyris Covan, irregular, carefully sized, structured to avoid reporting, thresholds, had originated from a holding account connected to this man's LLC and had begun approximately 8 months after Arundel's disappearance. Forsyth's assessment, delivered with characteristic precision, was that the evidence was consistent with a payment arrangement designed to ensure that a woman who had taken custody of a child was financially incentivized to maintain that custody quietly and to avoid inquiry into the child's origins. Consistent with, Marcellus said. Not confirmed. Not confirmed, Forsyth agreed. The man in question will need to be interviewed by law enforcement with appropriate authority. This goes beyond what I can establish through research alone. I understand. Send me everything you have. All of it, formatted for legal review. He forwarded the package to Patricia that evening. She read it overnight and called him the following morning. This is enough to take to the police, she said. Not enough to guarantee action, but enough to make a credible case for reopening the original investigation. Then we take it to the police. Marcellus, she paused. The DNA results come back in 2 days. I would suggest waiting for those results. Before approaching law enforcement, because the nature of that conversation changes significantly depending on what the results show. She was right. He knew she was right. He agreed to wait. He spent those 2 days doing something he had not done in many years. He went home in the evenings at a reasonable hour. He sat in the apartment that he had furnished for function rather than comfort, and had never quite learned to inhabit as anything other than a place where he slept and worked. He ate meals that he actually tasted instead of consuming as fuel. He sat by the window in the evenings and looked out at the city without trying to think about anything in particular. On the second evening, he took the photograph out of the desk drawer and set it on the table in front of him. He looked at it for a long time, the dark-haired boy in the blue jacket, laughing at something outside the frame, with the uncomplicated wholeness of a child who has no awareness of what waits beyond the moment he is living in. Marcellus looked at that expression for a long time. He thought about what it must have been like to grow up without it, to have it replaced, gradually, by whatever expression a person develops when they learn very early that the world is uncertain and that the people in it cannot always be counted on to stay. He thought about Calum Voss arriving at the emergency department, alone, 4 times, with lungs that were getting worse each visit. He thought about what it meant to be 20 years old and sick, and to have no one who came when you needed them. He put the photograph back in the drawer. Whatever the results said in 2 days, something had already been made clear to him. A young man had been failed, repeatedly and systematically, by every structure that should have protected him. That was true regardless of what any genetic test confirmed. And Marcellus Viremont Hale, who had spent 17 years building careful structures around his own inability to protect his son, found that this fact had settled into him somewhere deep and permanent in a place that no amount of professional composure was going to be able to reach. On the 10th business day, Patricia called at 9:17 in the morning. "The results are in," she said. "Are you ready?" He looked out the window. He thought about blue shoes by a front door. He thought about a stuffed rabbit at the top of a staircase. He thought about 17 years of lists and structures and carefully managed waiting. "Yes," he said. "I'm ready." Patricia did not make him wait. "The test confirms a full biological match," she said. "Calum Voss is Arendor Hale." Marcellus did not respond immediately. He was standing by the window of his office, and he remained standing there, looking at the city below, while the sentence settled into him the way that certain things settle. Not like a shock, but like the final piece of something very large coming to rest after a long time in motion. He had prepared himself for both outcomes. He had told himself, repeatedly and with genuine conviction, that he was ready for either answer. He had believed that was true. He understood now that it had not been entirely true. You cannot fully prepare for the confirmation of something you have needed to know for 17 years. You can manage the anticipation. You cannot rehearse the arrival. "There is something else in the report," Patricia said. Her voice had shifted, still steady, but carrying something careful in it. "The medical assessment accompanying the genetic results includes a notation from the reviewing physician. The respiratory condition Calum is currently being treated for is classified as advanced. The notation states that based on the documented progression visible in his prior hospital records, the condition was at a treatable stage approximately 4 years ago. With standard ED intervention at that point, the physician's assessment is that the current level of damage would likely not have occurred." The city continued below the window. Traffic, movement, the ordinary, indifferent machinery of a morning. "He will recover?" Marcellus asked. "He will survive," Patricia said, carefully, "with permanent limitations." Marcellus nodded, though there was no one to see it. 4 years ago, Calum Voss had been 16 years old, arriving alone at an emergency department with a condition that was still manageable, still reversible, still something that a person with access to consistent medical care would simply have treated and moved past. Instead, it had been partially addressed and inadequately followed up, and the 16-year-old had gone back to wherever he came from, and the condition had continued its quiet, patient progress. "Schedule a meeting with law enforcement," Marcellus said. "Today, if possible, we bring them everything. Forsyth's full report, the financial documentation, the connection to the original investigation, all of it." I'll make the calls this morning. And Patricia. He paused. I want to meet him. As soon as the legal framework permits it. Whatever steps are required, I want them started today. There was a brief silence on the line. I'll start the process, she said. Marcellus, be prepared for the fact that this meeting may not go the way you hope. He knew that. He had known it for weeks, in the part of himself that was always running the honest calculation beneath the necessary hope. Calum Voss had not grown up waiting to be found. He had grown up learning to need no one. A confirmed DNA result did not undo 20 years of living. It did not make a stranger into a father overnight. Whatever came. Next would be slow and uncertain and without any guarantee of the ending that 17 years of waiting had shaped itself around. Marcellus understood that. He accepted it. I know, he said. Schedule the meeting anyway. They met on a Wednesday afternoon in a small room the hospital reserved for family consultations. Neutral furniture, a window facing an interior courtyard, a social worker named Grace positioned quietly near the door. Patricia had arranged everything. The legal framework had taken 2 additional weeks to establish. Marcellus had not rushed it. Calum Voss was sitting in a chair beside the bed when Marcellus entered. He was thin in the way that chronic illness makes a person thin, not fragile exactly, but economical, as though the body had learned to carry only what was strictly necessary. He had dark hair and his mother's eyes, which Marcellus had not anticipated, and which required him to take one quiet breath before continuing into the room. Calum looked at him without expression. Not hostility, not curiosity. Simply the careful, measured look of someone who had learned very early that new people in a room were information to be assessed before they were anything else. Marcellus sat down across from him. He had prepared something to say. He had revised it many times. Sitting in that room, looking at his son's face for the first time in 17 years, he understood that none of what he had prepared was right. So he said the only true thing he had. I looked for you. I never stopped. Calum was quiet for a moment. Outside, the courtyard held a single tree just beginning to show the first pale signs of spring. I didn't know anyone was looking, Calum said. His voice was calm and a little rough from the breathing apparatus he still used at night. There was no accusation in it. That was almost harder to absorb than accusation would have been. They sat together for 40 minutes. They did not resolve anything. They did not reach any conclusions about what came next or what their relationship would eventually become. Marcellus did not make promises he could not guarantee, and Calum did not offer warmth he did not yet possess. But they talked. Carefully, slowly, the way 2 people talk when they are strangers, who share something enormous and are trying to find the edges of what that means. In the weeks that followed, the legal proceedings moved forward on multiple tracks simultaneously. Lyrise Coven was charged with custodial fraud and child endangerment. Her defense presented the circumstances of her own life, the poverty, the pressure, the payments she had received from a source she claimed she had never fully understood. The court found her account partially credible and partially insufficient. She was convicted on the lesser charges. The sentence was modest. Many people found it inadequate. The man connected to the original investigation, the peripheral consultant whose LLC had funded 17 years of silence, was arrested and charged. His case was more complex, involving multiple jurisdictions and a chain of decisions whose full extent was still being untangled when the first charges were filed. The investigation into the original failure of the police case was reopened and assigned to an independent review board. Neither process moved quickly. Neither process produced the clean resolution that the clean statement of the facts might have suggested was possible. The law is thorough in ways that are not always satisfying, and justice in complicated cases rarely arrives in the shape that the people most affected by them need it to take. Calum underwent a surgical procedure in early spring that addressed the most acute of his respiratory complications. The surgery was successful. The permanent limitations Patricia had mentioned remained, but their scope was narrower than the most difficult projections had indicated. He would manage. He was, his physicians noted with a kind of professional admiration, remarkably resilient. Marcellus paid for everything without being asked and without attaching conditions to it. This was not generosity in the conventional sense. It was the only form of the past 17 years that he was in a position to do anything about, and he did it with the same methodical commitment he brought to every problem he was capable of solving. The relationship between them built slowly, which was the only way it could have built. Calum was not an easy person to know. He had spent 20 years developing a self-sufficiency that was, by now, structural, not a choice he made each morning, but a feature of how he was assembled. He did not reach for help naturally. He did not trust continuity. He expected people to be present until they were not. And he had organized his interior life around that expectation so thoroughly that its absence would have felt disorienting even if he had wanted it to be absent. Marcellus did not try to dismantle any of that. He had spent enough time thinking about it to understand that dismantling was not the right approach, and that patience was not a strategy, so much as the only honest response to a situation that had no shortcut. He showed up consistently. He asked questions and listened to the answers. He did not push for more than was offered, and did not perform more warmth than he actually felt, because Calum would have noticed the performance and it would have cost more than honesty. There were visits. There were occasional meals. There were phone calls that were brief at first and gradually became less so. There were long silences that were sometimes comfortable and sometimes not, and both of them were learning slowly to tell the difference. It was not the reunion that 17 years of quiet, carefully managed hope had sometimes, in unguarded moments, imagined. It was something more real than that, and more fragile, and in its fragility more worth protecting. Marcellus kept the photograph in the desk drawer. He had considered at various points moving it, displaying it somewhere, or perhaps simply retiring it now that the boy in the blue jacket had become a real person in a chair across a hospital consultation room. But he found that he was not ready to move it. It still meant something that he had not finished meaning. On a Sunday afternoon in late spring, Calum came to his apartment for the first time. He stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the city with the same assessing quiet that he brought to most new situations. Then he turned and looked, and at the room, the clean lines, the ordered surfaces, the environment that Marcellus had built as a counterweight to everything uncontrollable. "You live very carefully," Calum said. It was not a criticism. It was an observation, offered with the directness of someone who had learned that indirect communication was more trouble than it was worth. Marcellus considered the observation honestly. "I did," he said. "I'm working on it." Calum nodded slowly. He looked back at the window. The city moved below them, indifferent and continuous, and entirely unaware of the two people standing above it, trying to find their way toward each other across a distance that was not measurable in miles. They ordered food and ate at the kitchen table, talking about small things. Not the investigation, not the legal proceedings, not the 17 years. Small things. A documentary Calum had watched in the hospital, a building project Marcellus had been reviewing, the particular quality of late spring light in this city that both of them had lived in, separately and without knowing it, for longer than either cared to calculate. It was an ordinary afternoon. Quietly, genuinely ordinary. For a man who had lived for 17 years in the structured silence of a life built around an absence, ordinary was not a small thing. It was, in fact, everything. Some losses are never fully repaired. Some years cannot be returned. Some damage, to lungs, to trust, to the ordinary fabric of a life that should have been different, leaves marks that remain visible regardless of how much care is applied afterward. But care, applied consistently and without condition, does something even when it cannot do everything. It does not erase what was lost. It builds something new alongside it, slower, less certain, made of different materials than what came before. Marcellus Viramont Hale had spent 17 years building structures around absence. He was learning, late and imperfectly and with no guarantee of outcome, to build something different. Something that had another person in it. That was not nothing. That was, in the particular arithmetic of lives shaped by loss and the long effort of repair, quite a lot. Before we close today's story, Thank you for spending this time with Marcellus and Calum. Stories like this one exist because of you. If this story moved you in any way, we'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. What city? What state? What corner of this country or this world? It means more than you know to hear from the people on the other side of these words. What did you think of Marcellus, of Calum, of the people who failed? Them both, and the systems that looked the other way? We want to know your thoughts. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider it. Every subscription tells us that these stories matter, that the time and care that goes into them is worthwhile, and that we should keep bringing you more. It takes just a moment, and it makes all the difference in keeping this channel alive. We'll see you in the next story. Take care of yourselves and each other.